The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand hallways of Buckingham Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked quietly toward the family breakfast room. Her footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors, a sound she had grown accustomed to over the years since joining the royal family. Today felt different, though, heavier somehow, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Catherine had always tried her best to fit into the complex world of royal protocols and family dynamics. She understood her role, respected the traditions, and worked tirelessly to support her husband William and represent the monarchy with dignity. However, recent weeks had been particularly challenging, with whispers and tensions brewing behind closed doors. As she approached the breakfast room, voices drifted through the partially open door. Catherine paused, recognizing the sharp tone of Queen Camilla discussing what sounded like arrangements for an upcoming charity event. The conversation seemed normal at first, but something in Camilla's voice made Catherine hesitate before entering. "She simply doesn't understand how things work here," Camilla was saying to someone Catherine couldn't see. "All this modern nonsense about changing traditions. Some people forget their place in this family." Catherine felt her cheeks flush. Though no names were mentioned, the context made it clear who was being discussed. She had recently suggested some updates to a long-standing charity protocol, hoping to make events more accessible to younger donors. The suggestion had been met with resistance, but she hadn't expected such harsh private criticism. Taking a deep breath, Catherine pushed open the door and entered with a warm smile. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, though her heart was racing. The room fell silent as several family members and staff turned to acknowledge her presence. Camilla's expression shifted quickly from surprise to a practiced royal smile. "Catherine, dear, how lovely to see you this morning." The words were polite, but Catherine caught the slight edge in her voice. King Charles looked up from his newspaper, his weathered face showing genuine warmth as he saw his daughter-in-law. "Catherine, please join us. We were just discussing the upcoming events for next month." As Catherine took her seat, she noticed the subtle tension in the room. Staff members exchanged glances, and she could feel eyes watching her every move. This wasn't unusual in palace life, but today it felt more intense, more scrutinizing. The breakfast conversation continued with surface-level pleasantries about weather and schedules, but Catherine sensed undercurrents of something more serious brewing beneath the polite facade. She participated gracefully, asking about various family members and showing interest in upcoming royal duties, all while maintaining the composure expected of her position. After breakfast, Catherine excused herself to attend to her daily correspondence. As she walked through the corridors toward her private office, she encountered several staff members who seemed unusually formal in their greetings. Word traveled fast in the palace, and she wondered if her morning encounter had already become part of the day's gossip. Her private secretary was waiting with a stack of invitations and briefing papers. They discussed upcoming appearances, charity visits, and official functions. Catherine threw herself into the work, finding comfort in the structured routine of royal duties. Each engagement was carefully planned, each speech meticulously prepared, and each public appearance designed to support various causes close to her heart. However, as the day progressed, Catherine began noticing small changes in how she was being treated. Conversations would pause when she entered rooms, staff seemed more formal than usual, and she caught several meaningful looks exchanged between palace personnel. The atmosphere felt charged with unspoken tension. During a planning meeting for a children's hospital visit, Catherine suggested involving some young patients in a special photo opportunity to highlight their artwork. The idea was met with lukewarm responses and several comments about maintaining appropriate dignity and following established procedures. Her suggestions, which had previously been welcomed, now seemed to be met with resistance and skepticism. By afternoon, the weight of the day's subtle rejections and cold shoulders began to affect Catherine's usually positive demeanor. She found herself second-guessing interactions and wondering if she had somehow overstepped boundaries without realizing it. The isolation felt particularly acute in a place where she was surrounded by people but increasingly felt alone. As evening approached, Catherine made her way to the family's private sitting room. Hoping to find William and discuss the strange atmosphere she had been experiencing. The room was empty, except for the soft ticking of an antique clock and the gentle crackle of a fire in the ornate fireplace. She settled into a comfortable chair and reflected on her journey into royal life. The transition hadn't always been easy, but she had worked hard to earn her place and contribute meaningfully to the family's work. The criticism about understanding traditions stung particularly because she had spent years learning protocols, studying history, and consulting with experienced staff members about proper procedures. Catherine thought about her children and the example she wanted to set for them. She wanted them to see her as someone who stood up for what was right while respecting the institution they were born into. Finding that balance had always been delicate, but recently it felt like walking on increasingly thin ice. When William finally arrived, he immediately sensed something was troubling his wife. His familiar presence brought Catherine some comfort, but she wasn't sure how to explain the day's events without sounding paranoid or overly sensitive. Royal life required thick skin and the ability to navigate complex personalities and politics with grace. They discussed their children's activities and upcoming travel plans, but Catherine found it difficult to focus on the conversation. Her mind kept returning to the morning's overheard comments and the day's series of small but meaningful interactions that had left her feeling unwelcome in her own home. As night fell over the palace, Catherine prepared for bed with a heavy heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove herself once again. She had faced difficulties before and overcome them through patience, hard work, and determination. Whatever was brewing in the palace corridors, she would handle it with the same grace and dignity that had carried her through previous storms. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet, but Catherine sensed that tensions were far from resolved. Something bigger was building, and she could feel the approaching storm even if she couldn't yet see its full shape. All she could do was prepare herself for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, and trust that her commitment to duty and family would see her through whatever lay ahead. The next morning arrived with an unexpected urgency that would change everything. Catherine woke to find several urgent messages from her private secretary about a last-minute change to the day's schedule. A major donor to one of her charities had arrived unexpectedly and requested an immediate meeting about a significant contribution. Catherine quickly prepared for what she hoped would be a positive distraction from yesterday's tensions. She chose a professional navy dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace, wanting to present herself at her absolute best for such an important meeting. The potential donation could fund several new programs she had been working to establish. As she made her way to the meeting room, Catherine felt optimistic for the first time in days. This was exactly the kind of work that energized her. Connecting with people who shared her passion for making a real difference in communities across the country. She had spent months developing proposals for expanded mental health support for young mothers, and this donor had specifically expressed interest in that cause. However, as she approached the designated meeting room, Catherine was surprised to see it empty. Confused, she checked with nearby staff members who seemed equally puzzled about the meeting location. After several minutes of searching and multiple phone calls, she learned that the meeting had been moved to a different room without anyone informing her directly. When Catherine finally located the correct room, she found the donor already deep in conversation with Queen Camilla. The sight stopped her in her tracks. This was her meeting, arranged through her charity connections, yet somehow Camilla had taken over the discussion. Catherine watched through the glass door as Camilla gestured enthusiastically, while the donor nodded and took notes. Taking a deep breath, Catherine knocked and entered with a bright smile. "I'm so sorry I'm late," she said warmly to the donor. I had some confusion about the room location. Camilla looked up with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Oh, Catherine, I didn't realize you were joining us. Mr. Henderson and I were having such a productive discussion about his generous contribution to our family's charitable work. The donor, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, looked between the two women with obvious confusion. I thought I was meeting with the Princess of Wales specifically about the Maternal Mental Health Initiative. That's the program my foundation is most interested in supporting. An uncomfortable silence filled the room as Catherine realized what had happened. Somehow her meeting had been intercepted and redirected. She maintained her composure while her mind raced to understand how such a significant miscommunication could occur. Of course, Catherine said gracefully, taking a seat at the table. I've been working on that initiative for several months and would love to share the details with you, Mr. Henderson. Camilla's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Actually, we've just been discussing how this initiative might fit better under the broader umbrella of existing royal charitable work. Coordination is so important to avoid duplication of efforts. Catherine felt her heart sink as she listened to her carefully planned project being dismantled and absorbed into other programs. Months of research, consultation with mental health professionals, and coordination with local organizations were being casually redirected. She tried to interject with specific details about her work, but Camilla smoothly continued speaking over her. I've been involved in charitable work for many years, Camilla continued, and I've learned that sometimes newer members of the family benefit from guidance about how to most effectively channel their enthusiasm. The condescension in the comment was subtle, but unmistakable. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and frustration. This wasn't just about a charity meeting anymore. It was about respect, recognition, and her place within the royal family hierarchy. Mr. Henderson seemed to sense the tension and tried to diplomatically include both women in the conversation. Perhaps both perspectives would be valuable. I understand the Princess of Wales has done significant research on this specific issue. Of course, her interest is admirable, Camilla replied smoothly, but experience teaches us that established frameworks are usually more effective than starting completely new initiatives. Catherine found herself in an impossible position. Arguing her case too forcefully would appear undignified and potentially damage the charitable relationship entirely. Yet remaining silent meant watching her work be dismissed and her expertise questioned in front of someone whose support could help thousands of families. She chose her words carefully. I appreciate the value of established systems, but I believe there's also merit in addressing gaps that current programs might not fully cover. The research I've conducted suggests specific needs that aren't being met by existing initiatives. The meeting continued for another hour, with Catherine fighting to maintain relevance in discussions about her own project. Every suggestion she made was politely redirected or absorbed into broader existing programs. By the end, Mr. Henderson left with promises to consider supporting various royal charitable efforts, but Catherine's specific initiative had been effectively dissolved into other priorities. After the donor departed, Catherine remained in the meeting room with Camilla. The air between them felt thick with unspoken conflict. I hope you understand, Catherine, Camilla said in a tone that sounded motherly but felt patronizing, that coordination is essential in royal charitable work. We can't have family members pursuing conflicting agendas or confusing our supporters. Catherine chose her response carefully. I absolutely agree about coordination. I just wish there had been better communication about today's meeting so we could have presented a unified approach from the beginning. Communication works both ways, dear. Perhaps next time you could consult more broadly before developing new initiatives. Experience can be quite valuable in avoiding common mistakes. The conversation felt like a carefully constructed lecture disguised as friendly advice. Catherine nodded politely while internally struggling with frustration and disappointment. Months of work had been undermined in a single meeting, and she was being made to feel like the problem for not following protocols she hadn't been told existed. As they walked back toward the main palace areas, other staff members and family members they encountered seemed to watch their interaction with unusual interest. Catherine began to suspect that today's events weren't accidental or coincidental. The meeting confusion, the room changes, and Camilla's convenient availability all seemed too convenient to be mere miscommunication. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine activities, but Catherine found it difficult to concentrate on anything else. During a scheduled call with one of her patronages, she struggled to maintain her usual enthusiasm. The conversation about upcoming events felt hollow when she wasn't sure whether her own initiatives would survive future interference. That evening, Catherine sat in her private study reviewing correspondence and trying to process what had happened. She had always known that royal life involved complex politics and competing interests, but she had hoped that charitable work would be an area where collaboration rather than competition would prevail. A knock on her door interrupted her brooding. William entered, immediately noticing his wife's troubled expression. "Difficult day?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Catherine hesitated, unsure how to explain her concerns without sounding like she was complaining or causing family drama. Royal family dynamics were delicate, and accusations or grievances had to be handled very carefully. "I had some challenges with the charity meeting today," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. William listened as she described the morning's events, his expression growing more serious as she explained the confusion, the room changes, and the way her project had been redirected. He asked thoughtful questions about the timeline and the people involved, and Catherine could see him processing the implications of what she was describing. "This doesn't sound like normal coordination issues," William said slowly. "These kinds of miscommunications don't usually happen with high-priority meetings." Catherine felt relief that he was taking her concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as oversensitivity or misunderstanding. His support meant everything to her, especially when she was beginning to doubt her own perceptions of events. They discussed possible approaches to address the situation, from requesting clearer communication protocols to having direct conversations with relevant family members. However, both of them understood that challenging established hierarchy, especially regarding someone in Camilla's position, required careful consideration and perfect timing. As the evening wore on, Catherine felt the weight of isolation that had been building over recent days. Being part of the royal family meant constant scrutiny and complex relationships, but she had always believed that dedication and hard work would earn her acceptance and respect. Recent events suggested that perhaps she had been naive about the challenges she would continue to face. The palace settled into its nighttime routine, but Catherine lay awake thinking about the future. She had important work she wanted to accomplish and causes she deeply cared about supporting. Finding a way to navigate the political challenges while staying true to her values would require strength, patience, and probably some difficult conversations that she wasn't sure she was ready to have. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and new challenges. Catherine knew she would need to be strategic, diplomatic, and incredibly careful about how she proceeded. The stakes were higher than just her own comfort or success. They involved the causes she cared about and the people who needed the support her work could provide. The breaking point came 3 days later during what should have been a routine family planning meeting. The senior royals gathered in the oak-paneled conference room to discuss upcoming engagements, charity events, and public appearances for the following month. Catherine entered with her usual prepared notes and positive attitude, determined not to let recent tensions affect her professional demeanor. King Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table, with Queen Camilla to his right and other family members arranged around the polished surface. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting everything in a deceptively peaceful glow that would soon be shattered by what was about to unfold. The meeting began normally enough, with discussions about state visits, ceremonial duties, and various charitable commitments. Catherine listened carefully, taking notes and contributing when appropriate. She had learned to pick her moments carefully, speaking only when she had something substantial to add to the conversation. When the discussion turned to the Children's Mental Health Awareness Week that Catherine had been developing for months, she leaned forward with genuine enthusiasm. This was her expertise area, something she had worked on long before the recent charitable interference. She had research, partnerships with major hospitals, and support from leading child psychologists. "I've been working with Great Ormond Street Hospital and the Child Mind Institute," Catherine began, her voice confident and professional. "We've developed a comprehensive program that could reach over 50,000 families in the first year alone. The early intervention approach has shown remarkable success in pilot programs." She continued outlining the initiative, explaining the research behind it and the potential impact on children's lives. Catherine felt energized as she spoke about work that truly mattered to her, describing partnerships she had carefully cultivated and programs she had helped design from the ground up. However, as she spoke, Catherine noticed Camilla's expression growing increasingly stern. There were small signs at first: a slight frown, a tap of her pen against her notepad, a glance toward Charles that seemed loaded with meaning. The atmosphere in the room began to shift subtly, though Catherine continued presenting her work with passion and detail. When Catherine finished her presentation, she looked around the table expectantly, hoping for questions or feedback about the program details. Instead, she was met with an uncomfortable silence that stretched longer than normal meeting pauses. Finally, Camilla cleared her throat and spoke in a voice that carried authority and disapproval. "Catherine, I think we need to have a serious discussion about boundaries and appropriate consultation within this family." The words hit Catherine like cold water. She had expected discussion about logistics or timing, not a lecture about boundaries. Around the table, other family members shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I'm not sure I understand," Catherine replied carefully, though her heart had begun racing. "This initiative has been in development for several months, with full documentation and research support." Camilla's voice rose slightly, carrying a sharp edge that cut through the room's formal atmosphere. "That's exactly the problem. Months of work developed without proper consultation or coordination. You seem to think you can simply create programs without considering how they fit into our existing charitable framework." Catherine felt her cheeks flush as she realized this was becoming a public confrontation rather than a private discussion. Everyone in the room was watching, and she could sense the tension crackling in the air around them. "I followed all the protocols I was given," Catherine said, working to keep her voice steady. "I've consulted with your office multiple times and received approval for the research phase." "Approval for research is not approval for implementation," Camilla shot back, her voice growing louder and more forceful. "And certainly not approval to make commitments to major hospitals and institutions without final authorization." The accusation stung because Catherine knew she had been careful about making only preliminary arrangements pending final approval. She had been transparent about the program's development status in all her communications with partner organizations. "I've been very clear with all partners that everything was subject to final approval," Catherine responded, her own voice beginning to carry more strength. "I would never make commitments beyond my authority." Camilla stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. Her face was flushed with anger, and her voice carried a level of fury that shocked everyone present. "Your authority?" Camilla's voice rose to nearly a shout. You seem to have forgotten that you are not the head of this family's charitable work. You are not the one who determines priorities or makes final decisions about how resources are allocated. The room fell completely silent, except for Camilla's heavy breathing as she glared down at Catherine. Everyone around the table seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they weren't witnessing such an unprecedented outburst. Catherine sat perfectly still, her training in royal protocol warring with her natural instinct to defend herself and her work. She had never experienced such a public dressing down, and the humiliation burned through her chest like fire. But Camilla wasn't finished. You need to understand your place in this family and stop trying to overshadow established programs with your amateur efforts. Experience matters, and respect for hierarchy matters even more. The final words hung in the air like a slap. Catherine felt tears threatening behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in such a public setting. Around the table, she could see shock and discomfort on the faces of other family members who clearly hadn't expected to witness such a brutal confrontation. And then, cutting through the terrible silence that followed Camilla's tirade, came King Charles's voice. It was quiet, but carried unmistakable authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. That's enough. The two simple words stopped everything. Camilla turned toward her husband with surprise and perhaps a flash of defiance, but Charles was already rising from his chair with a dignity and presence that reminded everyone in the room exactly who held ultimate authority. Catherine, Charles said, his voice gentle but firm, your work on children's mental health has been exemplary. Your research is thorough, your partnerships are valuable, and your commitment to helping families is exactly what this institution should represent. Catherine looked up at her father-in-law with gratitude and surprise, hardly daring to believe that he was defending her so publicly and completely. Charles turned toward Camilla, and his voice carried a tone that no one in the room had ever heard him use before. It was the voice of a king, addressing a subject who had overstepped boundaries, not a husband speaking to his wife. Your behavior just now was unacceptable. Catherine has shown nothing but dedication, professionalism, and respect since joining this family. She has followed proper protocols, conducted herself with dignity, and developed programs that will genuinely help people who need our support. Camilla's face went pale as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She had challenged Catherine in front of the family, but now found herself being corrected by the king himself in the same public forum. Catherine's place in this family, Charles continued, his voice growing stronger, is as my daughter-in-law, a senior member of the royal family, and someone whose contributions I value greatly. Her authority comes from her position, her expertise, and my confidence in her judgment. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual sounds of the palace, distant footsteps, closing doors, muffled conversations, seemed to have stopped entirely. Everyone in the room understood they were witnessing a moment that would reshape family dynamics permanently. Charles sat back down and addressed Catherine directly. Please continue with your presentation. I would like to hear more about the implementation timeline and how we can best support this important work. Catherine took a shaky breath and resumed her presentation, her voice growing stronger as she continued. Around the table, other family members began asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions, as if the confrontation had somehow cleared the air and allowed for genuine collaboration. Camilla remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly sat down. She said nothing for the rest of the meeting, but her silence spoke volumes. The balance of power in the room had shifted fundamentally, and everyone present understood that things would be different going forward. When the meeting finally ended, family members filed out quietly, many stopping to speak with Catherine about her program or offer their support. Charles approached her as she gathered her papers. Your work matters, he said simply. Don't let anyone make you forget that. As Catherine walked back to her office, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. She now knew exactly where she stood within the family hierarchy and understood that her contributions were valued at the highest levels. The palace corridors no longer felt hostile or unwelcoming. Staff members who passed her seemed to nod with more respect, and she sensed that word of the morning's events was already spreading through the palace network. The dynamics had changed, and everyone would need to adjust to the new reality. Catherine settled at her desk with renewed energy and purpose. She had important work to do, children to help, and a future to build. The storm had passed, and she had not only survived it but emerged stronger and more confident in her role within the royal family. Outside her window, the sun broke through the clouds that had covered London all morning, flooding her office with warm, golden light that seemed to promise better days ahead.